Psychological Types, or The Psychology of Individuation by Carl Gustav Jung, translated by Helton, Godwin, Baynes. Section 3, Chapter 1, The Problem of Types in the History of Classical and Medieval Thought. Part 1, Psychology in the Classical Age, the Gnostics, Tertullian, and Origin. So long as the historical world has existed, there has always been psychology. Objective psychology, however, is of only recent growth. We might affirm of the science of former times that the lack of objective psychology corresponds with the proportionate yield of the subjective element. Hence, the works of the ancients are full of psychology, but only little of it can be described as objective psychology. This may be conditioned in no small measure by the peculiarity of human relationship in classic and medieval times. The ancients had, if one may so express it, an almost exclusively biological appreciation of their fellow men. This is everywhere apparent in the habits of life and legal conditions of antiquity. Insofar as a judgment of value found any general expression, the medieval world had a metaphysical valuation of its fellow men. This had its source in the idea of the imperishable value of the human soul. This metaphysical valuation, which may be regarded as a compensation to the standpoint of antiquity, is just as unfavorable as the biological valuation, so far as that personal appraisement is concerned, which can alone be the groundwork of an objective psychology. There are indeed not a few who hold that a psychology can be written ex cathedra. Nowadays, however, most of us are convinced that an objective psychology must, above all, be grounded upon observation and experience. This foundation would be ideal, if only it were possible. But the ideal and the purpose of science do not consist in giving the most exact possible description of facts. Science cannot yet compete with kinematographic and phonographic records. It can fulfill its aim and purpose only in the establishment of law, which is merely an abbreviated expression for manifold and yet correlated processes. This purpose transcends the purely experimental by means of the concept, which, in spite of general and proved validity, will always be a product of the subjective psychological constellation of the investigator. In the making of scientific theory and concept, much that is personal and incidental is involved. There is also a psychological personal equation, not merely a psychophysical. We can see colors, but not wavelengths. This well-known fact must nowhere be more seriously held in view than in psychology. The operation of the personal equation has already begun in the act of observation. One sees what one can best see from oneself. Thus, first and foremost, one sees the mote in one's brother's eye. No doubt the mote is there, but the beam sits in one's own and may somewhat hinder the act of seeing. I misdoubt the principle of pure observation in so-called objective psychology unless one confines oneself to the eyepieces of the chronoscope, or the ergograph, and such like psychological apparatus. With such methods, one also ensures oneself against too great a yield of experimental psychological facts. But the personal psychological equation becomes even more important in the presentation or the communication of observations, to say nothing of the interpretation and abstraction of experimental material. Nowhere, as in psychology, is the basic requirement so indispensable that the observer and investigator should be adequate to his object, in the sense that he should be able to see not the subject only, but also the object. The demand that he should see only objectively is quite out of the question, for it is impossible. We may well be satisfied if we do not see too subjectively. That the subjective observation and interpretation agrees with the objective facts of the psychological object is evidence for the interpretation only insofar as the latter makes no pretense to be universal, but intends to be valid only for that field of the object that is under consideration. To this extent, it is just the beam in one's own eye that enables one to detect the mote in the brother's eye. The beam in one's own eye, in this case, does not prove, as already said, that the brother has no mote in his, but the impairment of vision might easily give rise to a general theory that all motes are beams. The recognition and taking to heart of the subjective limitation of knowledge in general, and of psychological knowledge in particular, is a basic condition for the scientific and accurate estimation of a psyche differing from that of the observing subject. This condition is fulfilled only when the observer is adequately informed concerning the compass and nature of his own personality. He can, however, be sufficiently informed only when he has, in great measure, freed himself from the compromising influence of collective opinion and feeling, and has thereby reached a clear conception of his own individuality. The further we go back into history, the more we see personality disappearing beneath the wrappings of collectivity. And if we go right down to primitive psychology, we find absolutely no trace of the idea of the individual. In place of individuality, we find only collective relationship or participation mystique. But the collective attitude prevents the understanding and estimation of a psychology which differs from that of the subject, because the mind that is collectively orientated is quite incapable of thinking and feeling in any other way than by projection. What we understand by the concept individual is a relatively recent acquisition in the history of the human mind and human culture. It is no wonder, therefore, that the earlier all-powerful collective attitude almost entirely prevented an objective psychological estimation of individual differences and forbade any general scientific objectification of individual psychological processes. It was owing to this very lack of psychological thinking that knowledge became psychologized, that is, crowded with projected psychology. Striking instances of this are to be seen in the first attempts at philosophical explanation of the universe. The development of individuality, with the resulting psychological differentiation of man, goes hand in hand with a de-psychologicizing of objective science. These reflections may appear why the springs of objective psychology have such a niggardly flow in the material handed down to us from antiquity. The description of the four temperaments gathered from antiquity is hardly a psychological typification, since the temperaments are scarcely more than psychophysiological complexions. But this lack of information does not mean that we possess no trace in classical literature of the reality of the psychological antithesis in question. Thus, Gnostic philosophy established three types, corresponding perhaps with the three basic psychological functions: thinking, feeling, and sensation. The pneumatici might correspond with thinking, the psychici with feeling, and the hylici with sensation. The inferior estimation of the psychici accorded with the spirit of the gnosis, which, in contrast with Christianity, insisted upon the value of knowledge. But the Christian principle of love and faith did not favor knowledge. The pneumaticist would accordingly suffer a decline in value within the Christian sphere, insofar as he distinguished himself merely by the possession of the gnosis, that is, knowledge. Differences in type should also be remembered when we are considering the long and somewhat dangerous fight which, from the earliest beginnings, the Church conducted against the Gnosticism. In the practical tendency that undoubtedly prevailed in early Christianity, the intellectual, when, in obedience to his fighting instinct, he did not lose himself in apologetic polemics, scarcely came into his own. The regula fide was too narrow and permitted no independent movement. Moreover, it was poor in positive intellectual content. It contained a few ideas which, although of enormous practical value, were a definite obstacle to thought. The intellectual was much more hardly hit by the sacrificium intellectus than the man of feeling. Hence, it is easy to understand that the vastly superior intellectual content of the gnosis, which in the light of our present intellectual development has not only lost, but has indeed considerably gained in value, must have made the greatest possible appeal to the intellectual within the Church. For him it was in very sooth the enticement of the world. Asceticism, in particular, caused grave trouble to the Church, with its contention that Christ possessed only an apparent body, and that his whole earthly existence and passion had been merely a semblance. In this contention, the purely intellectual was given too prominent a part at the expense of human feeling. Perhaps the battle with the gnosis is most clearly presented to us in two figures who were extremely influential, not only as fathers of the Church, but also as personalities. These are Tertullian and Origen, who lived about the end of the 2nd century. Schultz says of them, quote, "One organism is able to take in nourishment well nigh omnivorously and to assimilate it to its own nature. Another, with equal persistence, rejects it again with every appearance of passionate refusal." Thus essentially opposed, Origen identified himself with one side, Tertullian with the other. Their reaction to the gnosis is not only characteristic of the two personalities and their philosophy of life, it is also fundamentally significant of the position of the gnosis in the mental life and religious tendencies of that time. End quote. Tertullian was born in Carthage somewhere about 160 AD. He was a pagan and yielded himself to the lascivious life of his city until about his 35th year, when he became a Christian. He was the author of numerous writings wherein his character, which is our special interest, unmistakably shows itself. Clear and distinct are his unexampled, noble-hearted zeal, his fire, his passionate temperament, and the profound inwardness of his religious understanding. He is fanatical, ingeniously one-sided for the sake of an accepted truth, impatient, an incomparable fighting spirit, a merciless opponent, who sees victory only in the total annihilation of his adversary, and his speech is like a flashing steel, wielded with inhuman mastery. He is the creator of the Church Latin, which lasted for more than 1,000 years. He it was who coined the terminology of the early Church. Quote, "Had he seized upon a point of view, then he must follow it through to its every conclusion, as though lashed by legions from hell, even when right had long since ceased to be on his side, and all reasonable order lay mutilated before him." End quote. The passion of his thinking was so inexorable that again and again he alienated himself from the very thing for which he would have given his heart's blood. Accordingly, his ethical code is bitter in its severity. Martyrdom he commanded to be sought and not shunned. He permitted no second marriage and required the permanent veiling of persons of the female sex. The gnosis, which in reality is a passion for thought and cognition, he attacked with unrelenting fanaticism, including both philosophy and science, which are so closely linked up with it. To him is ascribed the sublime confession, "Credo qua absurdum est," I believe because it is against reason. This, however, does not altogether accord with historical fact. He merely said, quote, "Et mortus est de filius, prorsus credibile est, qua ineptum est, et sepultus resurrexis certum est qua impossibile est." Close quote. That is, "And the Son of God died. This is therefore credible, just because it is absurd. And he rose again from the tomb. This is certain, because it is impossible." By virtue of the acuteness of his mind, he saw through the poverty of philosophic and of Gnostic learning, and contemptuously rejected it. He invoked against it the testimony of his own inner world, his own inner realities, which were one with his faith. In the shaping and development of these realities, he became the creator of those abstract conceptions which still underlie the Catholic system of today. The irrational inner reality had, for him, an essentially dynamic nature. It was his principle, his consolidated position in face of the world and the collectively valid or rational science and philosophy. I translate his own words. Quote, "I summon new witnesses, or rather a witness more known than any written monument, more debated than any system of life, more published abroad than any promulgation, greater than the whole of man, yea, that which constitutes the whole man. Approach then, O my soul, shouldst thou be something divine and eternal, as many philosophers believe, the less wilt thou lie, or not wholly divine, because mortal, as forsooth Epicurus alone contends, then so much the less canst thou lie, whether thou comest from heaven, or art born of earth, whether compounded of numbers or atoms, whether thou hast thy beginning with the body, or art later joined thereto, what matter indeed whence thou springest, or how thou makest man what he is, namely a reasonable being, capable of perception and knowledge. But I call thee not, O soul, as proclaiming wisdom, trained in the schools, conversant with libraries, fed and nourished in the academies and pillared halls of Attica. No, I would speak with thee, O soul, as wondrous simple and uneducated, awkward and inexperienced, such as thou art for those who have nothing else but thee, even just as thou comest from the alleys, from the street corners, and from the workshops. It is just thy ignorance I need." End quote. The self-mutilation achieved by Tertullian in the Sacrificium Intellectus led him to the unreserved recognition of the irrational inner reality, the real ground of his faith. That necessity of the religious process which he sensed in himself, he seized in the incomparable formula, anima naturaliter Christiana, that is, the soul is naturally Christian. With the Sacrificium Intellectus, philosophy and science, hence the gnosis also, had no more meaning for him. In the further course of his life, the qualities I have depicted stood out in bolder relief. While the Church was driven to compromise more and more with the masses, he revolted against it and became a follower of that Phrygian prophet Montanus, an ecstatic, who represented the principle of absolute denial of the world and complete spiritualization. In violent pamphlets, he now began to assail the policy of Pope Calixtus I, and thus, together with Montanism, fell more or less extra ecclesiam. According to a statement of St. Augustine, he must later even have rejected Montanism and founded a sect of his own. Tertullian is a classical representative of the introverted thinking type. His very considerable and keenly developed intellect is flanked by unmistakable sensuality. That psychological process of development, which we term the Christian, led him to the sacrifice, the amputation, of the most valuable function, a mythical idea which is also contained in the great and exemplary symbol of the sacrifice of the Son of God. His most valuable organ was the intellect, including that clear discernment of which it was the instrument. Through the sacrificium intellectus, the way of purely intellectual development was forbidden him. It forced him to recognize the irrational dynamis of his soul as the foundation of his being. The intellectuality of the gnosis, its specifically rational coinage of the dynamic phenomenon of the soul, must necessarily have been odious to him, for that was just the way he had to forsake in order to recognize the principle of feeling. In Origen, we may recognize the absolute opposite of Tertullian. Origen was born in Alexandria about 185 AD. His father was a Christian martyr. He himself grew up in that quite unique mental atmosphere wherein the ideas of East and West mingled. With an intense yearning for knowledge, he eagerly absorbed all that was worth knowing and accepted everything, whether Christian, Jewish, Grecian, or Egyptian, which at that time the teeming intellectual world of Alexandria offered him. He distinguished himself as a teacher in a school of catechists. The pagan philosopher Porphyrius, a pupil of Plotinus, said of him, quote, "His outer life was that of a Christian and against the law, but in his view of things, phenomenal and divine, he was a Hellenist and substituted the conception of the Greeks for the foreign myths." End quote. Already before AD 211, his self-castration had taken place. His inner motives for this may indeed be guessed, but historically they are not known to us. Personally, he was of great influence and had a winning speech. He was constantly surrounded by pupils and a whole host of stenographers who gathered up the precious words that fell from the Reverend Master's lips. As an author, he was extraordinarily fertile, and he developed an amazing academic activity. In Antioch, he even delivered lectures on theology to the emperor's mother, Mamaea. In Caesarea, he was the head of a school. His teaching activities were considerably interrupted by his extensive journeyings. He possessed extraordinary scholarship and had an astounding capacity for the investigation of things in general. He hunted up old Bible manuscripts and earned special merit for his textual criticism. Quote, "He was a great scholar, indeed the only true scholar the ancient church possessed," end quote, says Harnack. In complete contrast to Tertullian, Origen did not bar the door against the influence of Gnosticism. In fact, he even transferred it, in attenuated form, into the bosom of the church. Such at least was his aim. Indeed, judging by his thought and fundamental views, he was himself almost a Christian Gnostic. His position in regard to faith and knowledge is portrayed by Harnack in the following psychologically significant words. Quote, "The Bible, in likewise, is needful to both. The believers receive from it the realities and commandments which they need, while the scholars decipher thoughts therein, and gather from it that power which guideth them to the contemplation and love of God, whereby all material things, through spiritual interpretation, allegorical exegesis, hermeneutics, seem to be recast into a cosmos of ideas, until all is at last surmounted in the ascent, and left behind as stepping stones, while only this remaineth, the blessed abiding relationship of the God-created creature soul to God." End quote. His theology, as distinguished from Tertullian's, was essentially philosophical. It was thoroughly pressed, so to speak, into the frame of a Neoplatonic philosophy. In Origen, the two spheres of Grecian philosophy and the gnosis on one hand, and the world of Christian ideas on the other, peacefully and harmoniously intermingle. But this daring, intelligent tolerance and sense of justice also led Origen to the fate of condemnation by the Church. The final condemnation, to be sure, only took place posthumously, when Origen as an old man had been tortured in the persecution of the Christians by Decius, and had died not long after from the effects of the torture. In 399, Pope Anastasius I pronounced the condemnation, and in 543 his heresy was anathematized by a synod convoked by Justinian, which judgment was upheld by later councils. Origen is a classical example of the extroverted type. His basic orientation is towards the object. This shows itself in his conscientious consideration of objective facts and their conditions. It is also revealed in the formulation of that supreme principle, amor et visio Dei. The Christian process of development encountered in Origen a type whose bedrock foundation is the relation to the object, a type that has ever symbolically expressed itself in sexuality, which also accounts for the fact that there exist, even today, certain theories which reduce every essential function of the soul down to sexuality. Castration is therefore the adequate expression of the sacrifice of the most valuable function. It is entirely characteristic that Tertullian should perform the sacrificium intellectus, whereas Origen is led to the sacrificium phalli, since the Christian process demands a complete abolition of the sensual hold upon the object. In other words, it demands the sacrifice of the hitherto most valued function, the dearest possession, the strongest instinct. Considered biologically, the sacrifice is brought into the service of domestication, but psychologically, it opens a door for new possibilities of development to be inaugurated through the liberation from old ties. Tertullian sacrificed the intellect because it was that which most strongly bound him to worldliness. He battled with the gnosis because for him it represented the sidetrack into the intellectual, which at the same time involves also sensuality. Parallel with this fact, we find that in reality, Gnosticism was also divided into two schools. One school striving after a spirituality that exceeded all bounds, the other losing itself in an ethical anarchism, an absolute libertinism that shrank from no lechery, however atrocious and perverse. One must definitely distinguish between the Encratites and the Antitacts, or Antinomians, those opposed to order and law, who, in obedience to certain doctrines, sinned on principle and purposefully gave themselves to unbridled debauchery. To the latter school belong the Nicolaitans, the Archontici, and so forth, and the aptly named Borborites. How closely the apparent antithesis lay side by side is shewn by the example of the Archontici, for this same sect divided into an Encratitic and an Antinomian school, both of which remained logical and consistent. If anyone wants to know what are the ethical results of a bold intellectualism carried out on a large scale, let him study the history of Gnostic morals. He will thoroughly understand the sacrificium intellectus. These people were also practically consistent and lived what they conceived, even to absurd lengths. But Origen, in the mutilation of himself, sacrificed the sensual hold upon the world. For him, evidently, the intellectual was not so much a specific danger as feeling and sensation, with their enchainment to the object. Through castration, he freed himself from the sensuality that was coupled with Gnosticism. He could then yield himself unafraid to the riches of Gnostic thought, while Tertullian, through his sacrifice of intellect, turned away from the gnosis, but thereby reached a depth of religious feeling that we miss in Origen. Quote, "In one way he was superior to Origen," says Schultz, "because in his deepest soul he lived every one of his words. It was not reason that carried him away, like the other, but the heart. But in another respect, he stands far behind him, inasmuch as he, the most passionate of all thinkers, was on the verge of rejecting knowledge altogether, for his battle against the gnosis was tantamount to a complete denial of human thought." End quote. We see here how, in the Christian process, the original type has actually become reversed. Tertullian, the acute thinker, becomes the man of feeling, while Origen becomes a scholar and loses himself in the intellect. Logically, of course, it is quite easy to reverse the state of affairs and to say that Tertullian had always been the man of feeling and Origen the intellectual. Disregarding the fact that the difference of type is not done away with by this procedure, but exists as before, the reversed point of view still has to be explained. How comes it that Tertullian saw his most dangerous enemy in the intellect, while Origen in sexuality? One could say they were both deceived, and one could advance the fatal result of both lives by way of argument. One must assume, if that were the case, that both had sacrificed the less important thing, and thus, to a certain extent, both had made a bargain with fate. That is also a view which contains a principle of recognizable validity. Are there not just such slyboots among the primitives who approach their fetish with a black hen under the arm, saying, "See, here is thy sacrifice, a beautiful black pig"? I am, however, of the opinion that the depreciatory method of explanation, notwithstanding the unmistakable relief which the ordinary human being feels in dragging down something great, is not under all circumstances the correct one, even though it may appear to be very biological. But from what we can personally know of these two great ones in the realm of the mind, we must say that their whole nature and quality had such sincerity that their Christian conversion was neither a fraudulent enterprise nor mere deceit, but had both reality and truthfulness. We shall not lose ourselves upon a bypath if we take this opportunity of trying to grasp what is the psychological meaning of this breaking of the natural instinctive course, which is what the Christian process of sacrifice seems to be. From what has been said above, It follows that conversion signifies also a transition to another attitude. It is further clear whence the impelling motive towards conversion arises, and how far Tertullian was right in conceiving the soul as naturaliter Christiana. The natural instinctive course, like everything in nature, follows the principle of least resistance. One man is rather gifted here, another there. Or again, adaptation to the early environment of childhood may demand either relatively more restraint and reflection, or relatively more sympathy and participation, according to the nature of the parents and other circumstances. Thereby, a certain preferential attitude is automatically molded, which results in different types. Insofar then as every man, as a relatively stable being, possesses all the basic psychological functions, it would be a psychological necessity with a view to perfect adaptation that he should also employ them in equal measure. For there must be a reason why there are different ways of psychological adaptation. Evidently one alone is not sufficient, since the object seems to be only partially comprehended when, for example, it is either merely thought or merely felt. Through a one-sided, typical attitude, there remains a deficit in the resulting psychological adaptation, which accumulates during the course of life. From this deficiency, a derangement of adaptation develops, which forces the subject towards a compensation. But the compensation can be obtained only by means of amputation, that is, sacrifice, of the hitherto one-sided attitude. Thereby, a temporary heaping up of energy results, and an overflow into channels hitherto not consciously used, though already existing unconsciously. The adaptation deficit, which is the causa efficiens of the process of conversion, becomes subjectively perceived as a vague sense of dissatisfaction. Such an atmosphere prevailed at the turning point of our era. A quite astonishing need of redemption came over mankind, and brought about that unheard-of efflorescence of every sort of possible and impossible cult in ancient Rome. Moreover, representatives of living the full life theory were not wanting, who, albeit innocent of biology, operated with similar arguments founded on the science of that day. They, too, could never be done with speculations as to why it is that mankind is in such a poor way. Only the causalism of that day, as compared with the science of ours, was somewhat less restricted. Their harking back reached far beyond childhood to cosmogony, and many systems were devised that pointed to all sorts of events in remote antiquity as being the source of insufferable consequences for mankind. The sacrifice that Tertullian and Origen carried out is drastic, too drastic for our taste, but it corresponded with the spirit of that time, which was thoroughly concretistic. In harmony with this spirit, the gnosis simply took its visions as real, or at least as bearing directly upon reality. Hence, for Tertullian, there was an objective validity in the realities of his feeling. Gnosticism projected the subjective, inner perception of the attitude-changing process into the form of a cosmogenic system, and believed in the reality of its psychological figures. In my book, Psychology of the Unconscious, I left the whole question open as to the origin of the libido course peculiar to the Christian process. I spoke of a splitting of the libido into halves, each directed against the other. The explanation for this is to be found in the one-sidedness of the psychological attitude growing so extreme that the need for compensation became urgent on the side of the unconscious. It is precisely the Gnostic movement in the early Christian centuries which most clearly demonstrates the outbreak of unconscious contents in the moment of compensation. Christianity itself signified the demolition and sacrifice of the cultural values of antiquity, that is, of the classical attitude. As regards the problem of the present, it need hardly be said that it is quite indifferent whether we speak of today or of that age 2,000 years ago. End of section 3. Recording by Olivia.